Good afternoon. I'm excited to welcome you to the Low Income Energy Network's annual virtual conference. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is April Wepler, and I am the Engagement and Communications Coordinator with the Canadian Environmental Law Association, or CELA. And the theme of this year's conference is Cool It Now, Protecting Tenants from Extreme Heat. And we have a great agenda lined up for you today. So I'd like to start off today with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the lands and waters on which we live and work are the traditional territories since time immemorial of Indigenous peoples, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge that Indigenous communities across Canada have distinct cultures, traditions, and lifestyles. We are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these lands and waters, and we recognize that we have a great deal to learn and a significant amount of work to do to address historical and ongoing environmental injustices imposed on Indigenous peoples, including the denial of access to justice. For myself, I live on the banks of the Speed River, on the traditional lands of Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, and on the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and Six Nations of the Grand Watershed.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us all here today. My name is Z, and I have met many of you. I run the Low Income Energy Network, also known as LIEN. LIEN is a joint program of CELA, which is the Canadian Environmental Law Association, and ACTO, which is the Advocacy Centre for Tenants Ontario. Both ACTO and CELA are specialty legal clinics funded by Legal Aid Ontario. For those of you who are new here today and don't know who we are, in Ontario, LIEN is widely recognized as the primary go-to organization with expertise on low-income energy issues. LIEN was formed in 2004. We are a network of over 60 member organizations across Ontario, and we're comprised of community legal clinics, anti-poverty groups, affordable housing groups, environmental groups. As a network representing the intersection of interests related to low-income consumers and energy and sustainability, our focus is on reducing the energy bills of low-income consumers and ensuring that they're provided with the opportunity and tools to better manage their energy bills. Almost 20 years ago, LIEN developed a vision for a comprehensive strategy for reducing energy consumption and costs for Ontario's vulnerable low-income households. Through our persistent advocacy work with the Ontario government and the Ontario Energy Board, we were instrumental in bringing our vision to reality. So as you can see from the pyramid, as we move from the left pyramid to the right pyramid, we now have programs that help low-income consumers reduce their energy use through the introduction of free energy efficiency upgrades to their homes. We have low-income customer service rules that utility companies will offer, such as security deposit exemptions, waiving disconnection and reconnect fees, and a generous arrears repayment agreement. We also, in the middle of the pyramid, have an ongoing rate affordability program that provides low-income electricity customers with a monthly on-bill credit. And at the very top of the pyramid, we have an emergency financial assistance fund for low-income consumers who are in arrears or facing disconnection. Now on to the reason we're all here today. LIEN's annual conference is an opportunity to exchange ideas and learn from each other in an effort to ensure that low-income Ontarians are able to meet their basic energy needs affordably and sustainably. At this year's conference, we continue to focus on the impact of extreme heat on vulnerable and marginalized communities. Decarbonizing residential building stock is crucial to mitigating climate change, but decarbonization policies have the potential to create unintended harms for tenants, including unsustainable rent raises and unnecessary or even illegal evictions. These policies must be designed and implemented carefully to protect renters who are more likely than homeowners to be low-income, single-family homes, racialized communities, disabled, and other groups that already disproportionately bear the negative effects of climate change. And not doing so will exacerbate the housing crisis while driving more people into homelessness. These are some of the themes that we're going to explore today. So as for right now, I'm going to pass it on to our facilitator, Abhi, who will guide us through the day and keep us all on track. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Z. Hey, folks, I hope you can hear me okay. My name is Abi. I'm the Director of Action Research at Efficiency Canada, and I'm the MC and the timekeeper for today, trying to make sure that we're all staying on time and go home on time, safe and sound to our friends and family. So this year's conference, I know I was looking at the chat here, and I know some people were at the last year's conference, and I know some of us were also the years before. So this has been a theme for us here at the Low Income Energy Network, right? So in 2022, we talked about why we need to pay attention to protecting renters and tenants from extreme heat events. 2023, we talked about how we can advocate at the municipal level and then at different levels of government on how this year or two, when local community advocacy organizations and activists have tried working with city councils, what is the kind of feedback and pushback are they getting, and then how can we get past that speed bump? So this is like one of those like Empire Strikes Back situation, right, from Star Wars. So so what today we're going to hear from is from our community advocates, four of them, and we're very grateful because they're here on their lunch break to tell us about their experience in their own communities in advocating for municipal action on extreme heat events and municipal action on the right to cooling. And we'll hear on the how the Empire Strikes Back and what they experienced when they tried to talk to their city councils and stuff about issues like this. And then we will also hear from me. You'll hear from a couple of other folks on uh, what does this look like from the policy perspective? Like, how do we go from like tenant activism to crafting and enforcing city bylaws? We will also hear from folks on what is really the municipal jurisdiction. And I know some municipalities have tried to argue that they may or may not have jurisdiction to pass a maximum temperature bylaw. And so we will receive wisdom from our friends at SELA on what they, what the context of that is and what the legal opinion on that is on the municipal jurisdiction to pass a maximum temperature bylaw. And we'll also have a toolkit for activists, many of folks on this call, on how you too can advocate for municipal action on extreme heat and rental housing. At the end of the day, all of this effort is about helping renters um, live in homes that are comfortable throughout the seasons and that meet their needs. And I think, beginning this conference by hearing from that lived experience perspective, we have Anushan, who has lived in St. Jamestown for about the entire 20 years of his life, and is a part of a group of residents who our preparedness. So, and him and his team have been with the community resilience to extreme weather. So, crew team have been working in their community, and their efforts on this front have been recognized through the 2023 Greener City for All Award, and they also placed first in the Canadian Youth Climate Award. So, Anushan, I will turn this over to you, my friend, and I'll ask you to, if you're comfortable, turning on your camera and taking us away.
Yeah, hello everybody. My name's Anushin. I've been a resident in St. Jamestown for all 20 years of my life. I've been a volunteer with Crew since the summer of 2020, and I've been living in St. Jamestown for all my life. And one thing I've definitely noticed is that St. Jamestown has its own set of problems. As a predominantly low income neighborhood, the buildings reflect that. Most of the buildings in our area are just too old to be retrofitted and don't really have many other things to that are provided besides like a laundry room. Some of our buildings are under TCHC, one of which includes mine. And for most of my life, we've had a window AC until about a couple of years ago, which TCHC actually created an exchange program. Well, they will take our window AC and replace it with a new portable one. During some of my volunteering outreaching I've done with Crew and my other fellow volunteers, we found that some residents were having issues with their new ACs. Some claimed they were too noisy, some said they were taking up space, and we even had one instance of a resident claiming that they had to pay out of pocket for the tubing that connects the AC to their window. Personally, for me, I found that the AC only cools my living room and the kitchen that's connected there, while my rooms and the bathroom couldn't feel any of it. And one thing what we do at Crew is we want to offer residents like a sort of like a climate resilience hub, for example, like taking a recreational room already existing in the building, and we could transform that to a hub where, for example, if it was a really, really hot day, residents can potentially come together and use that room as a sort of cooling space and talk with one another about solutions with other residents that have come up ways to cool themselves. And beyond that, some of our buildings can commonly have water shutoffs and the occasional power shutoff. And I would imagine that if imagine having that happening during like a really hot day, that could be potentially disastrous, especially in my building where it's pretty common for a lot of people in our building to be either living alone, they're disabled, they're seniors. So, for example, if you're bound to a wheelchair and the power is off, how are you supposed to get out of your apartment? Like the elevators aren't going to work. There's no way you're taking the stairs, and so that is definitely a problem that St. Jamestown faces. And we at Crew hope that we could potentially bridge the gap between low income residents and being able to keep them safe during extreme heat. Yeah, I guess I'll pass it on to Stuart of Acorn Hamilton.
Anushan, one quick second. Stuart, before you go on, I just wanted to thank Anushan. Thanks, man. That was awesome. Thanks for all the work that you do and for setting a standard for other communities to strive for, and especially, uh, as someone who's lived in a community for a long time, your lived experience and the way you're going about this work matters a lot. So thanks for doing your awesome work, man. Awesome. Okay, so now we will switch over and we're going to go to our community organizers and community activists. I'm going to introduce them all at once. And then I will pass from one to the other. So first we will have Eddie. Eddie was born and raised in Ottawa, has been fighting for social justice since he was a wee little lad. He's been with Acorn since the late 2010s, and he's going to talk to us about Acorn Ontario's like Beat the Heat campaign, touching on Ottawa where he lives, but also giving us a little bit of a overview of some of the other communities as well in Ontario. Then we'll have Stuart, who is the Acorn member in Hamilton's East End. And if you folks might recognize Stuart from some of our previous LIEN conferences. And has been a huge part of Acorn Hamilton's citywide campaigns particularly on the maximum heat bylaw. Then we will have Tara from SCAN in Kingston, and Tara has been calling Kingston home for about 35 years. She's been a renter since she was 17 years old, and leaving her home at the age of 17. And as a mother of three, she has worked as a housing support worker, and so she comes at this from both the lived experience perspective and also perhaps from the other side of the table in helping and working with other folks who may be experiencing some of the challenges that we're hoping to address through stuff that we will talk about this conference. And she's been a member of Kingston's in 2019. She was a member of Kingston Mayor's Task Force on Housing, and right now is involved in the Just Future Kingston Housing Group. And then after that, we will have Hausen from TIA, which is the Toronto Environmental Alliance. Hausen, I'm sorry, I hope that I'm saying that right. And Hausen was raised in Etobicoke and has been a climate and climate justice campaigner for about 25 years or more. And over the years, he's worked for, this is the who's list of environmental organizations in Canada, like Sierra Youth Coalition, Sierra Club Canada, Greenpeace, Environmental Defense, Indigenous Climate Action, and the UN Development Fund. And he's also been a campaigner for Stand.Earth. He holds degrees from McGill and Yale and is certified in organizational greenhouse accounting. So with that said, and again, we will talk to our community advocates and activists will tell us about their communities, and then we will do a quick Q&A with them, because I know some of them are here on their lunch break and they have to get back to their daily business. So Eddie, I'll pass it over to you first, my friend. Take it away, good sir.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Abby. I'm happy to be here to speak on behalf of Ontario Acorn. Now, for those not familiar, Acorn is a grassroots organization of low and moderate income people. Basically, we are member funded based on dues paying members so that we can stay independent from governments and corporations. We operate at a number of levels and have several chapters across Ontario as well as elsewhere in Canada, bringing us up to a total of 177,000 members across the country. So I personally am in Ottawa. I'm with Ottawa Acorn. And right after me, you're going to hear from Stuart from Hamilton Acorn. Um, so I'll go over a little bit of what we've been doing, not only in Ottawa, but in a couple of other cities across Ontario in terms of the Beat the Heat campaign. Really, as on honestly, a number of issues lately, Hamilton has been leading Ontario on this issue, and so in that respect, we're going to kind of save the best for last. So I can start with Ottawa, my city, of course, because so yeah. So actually, first I should maybe just define exactly what we're talking about with our Beat the Heat strategy. So it is a province-wide campaign where we're hoping to sort of start with cities like Hamilton and like Toronto, where city council is generally more friendly to us and our issues, and then we're hoping to be able to use that to build on that that precedent to achieve change in other places like Ottawa and smaller cities across the province. And basically what we're looking for, as you can see on the PowerPoint, is a maximum heat bylaw that requires landlords to keep units below 26 degrees. We are demanding that cities track heat-related deaths and illnesses, which is not something that is being done consistently in this province right now. And last but not least, programs to support tenants with the cost of running energy efficient air conditioners and heat pumps, because obviously neither do we want people to be priced out of the ability to have decent cooling, but we also want to make sure that it is environment energy efficient as much as we can. So yeah, so that would then I'll bring us back to Ottawa to start, where we have been working on this campaign for a little while now. We actually had a survey of 295 tenants to sort of, if you pardon the bad pun, sort of take the temperature, see where we are on this issue. And it turns out that 40% of those 295 people who participated in the survey had no air conditioning or other forms of cooling. So that is obviously a huge gap, and we hope that kind of big number will help to impress the people at City Hall who actually have the power to change this. One thing that has been helpful is that we had a public health report which came out, which supported our calls for a max heat bylaw. So, certainly at least the public health recognizes that this is an issue. And city staff are actually going to be reporting on the city's climate resiliency strategy early in the new year. And so right now we are working on finding a counselor who aligns with our values, aligns with our goals on this issue, so that they can move a motion to move in the direction of a max heat bylaw. So, we're making some progress. Toronto is, like I said, a little bit further ahead of us. They're already working on a feasibility study on max heat, and staff are actually expected to report back on that any day now. Our local chapters in Acorn have been organizing rallies, media hits, deputations, so they have really been all over this issue. They've been keeping it covered very well. And we've also been fighting to force landlords to rescind illegal extra charges for air conditioning that we've seen in the city of Toronto, as well as fighting to ensure that Toronto community housing tenants have access to free AC. So we've been fighting not only with what exists, but of course, moving towards actually enshrining these rights in a bylaw. Now, another interesting place actually is Mississauga, where we do also have our members from Peel Acorn. Now, interestingly, Mississauga does actually already have a maximum heat bylaw, but it only applies to tenants who already have AC. So, leaving a huge gap there that really needs to be filled. And Peel Acorn has launched a campaign to do just that, to extend the rights enjoyed by certain tenants to all tenants, and that's really our goal there in Mississauga. And then in London, the city has been directed, the city staff have been directed to explore a max heat bylaw, but unfortunately, the template they're looking at basing it on is Mississauga, which, like I said, has this huge gap of not covering people who don't already have AC. So our members in London, in the various chapters that we have in that city, have also been putting pressure on them. And in London, we also sit on a landlord and tenant forum, which gives us some voice. And so we're really hoping to be able to push in the direction of a max heat bylaw that applies to everyone and not just to certain tenants. But as I mentioned earlier, really the city in this province that is furthest ahead on this issue is Hamilton, and that is due in no small part to the work of our fellow members in Hamilton Acorn. So on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Stu so that he can tell us more about what they've been doing down in Hammertown.
Thank you very much, Eddie. I've definitely heard Hamilton referred to worse than Hammertown. Yes, my name is Stuart. I am a member of Acorn Hamilton. I'm the chair of our East End chapter. We have 4 chapters across the city. I have been raising the alarm about heat in apartments since 2020. It started with a Twitter thread that got a lot of local traction and ended up getting mentioned in an article in the Hamilton Spectator. Up next was writing my own op-eds for the Hamilton Spectator in 2021 on the issue. And then where Acorn Hamilton starts getting involved, a recap for those of you who may be unfamiliar with our extreme heat campaign. Next slide, please. In June 2022, we added an extreme heat campaign to our list of active causes. We launched our campaign with a Beat the Heat rally at City Hall. Next slide, please. The campaign's demands were very similar to the ones that Eddie listed off, if not identical. For the City of Hamilton to develop and implement a maximum heat bylaw for rental housing, for the City of Hamilton to develop a municipal program to support retrofits of market rental housing to reduce energy consumption and retrofit older market affordable housing stock to adapt to a hotter climate. For the City of Hamilton to expand measures in community and public spaces for residents to keep cool when outside the home. Things like more drinking fountains, more indoor cooling spaces open to the public, as well as improvements to Hamilton's tree canopy, all of these especially in low and moderate income tenant communities. And lastly, for the province to track heat-related deaths and illnesses, and for the city to support our call to the province to do so. So after the 2022 election, Acorn Hamilton started meeting with city councilors. Next slide, please. 6 Acorn members and 6 allied environmental and community groups delegated to the Public Health Committee meeting on May 15th, 2023, to call on the city of Hamilton to pass policies to protect tenants from extreme heat. On the slide there, myself, Jacqueline Wilson, who is also, I believe, presenting at some point today. Next slide, please. So during the meeting, Ward 2 Councillor Kretsch brought forward a motion seconded by Ward 4 Councillor Huang that passed unanimously 10-0, and it was later unanimously ratified by council. The motion directed staff to prepare a report for a maximum heat bylaw in time to be included in the 2024 budget and implemented by the summer of 2024. Don't know if anyone's checked a watch recently, but that's now passed. So, you know, we're making whatever progress we can. It has become a little slower moving forward. Next slide, please. A staff report came back in April of 2024 regarding the feasibility of tracking heat-related illnesses and deaths. This is municipally, not provincially. And the tracking of emergency department visits for pre-diagnostic heat-related complaints began this past summer. So we have been making progress on that front. 33 complaints were recorded, with a significant proportion happening in direct correlation with heat warnings, which is when public health issues a warning saying that the temperature is at a certain level and has been for long enough to kick off the warning. So city staff acknowledged that there may be limitations in tracking historical heat-related deaths, as correspondence with the coroner's office indicated that most heat-related deaths would not prompt a coroner examination. This creates a 2-year lag time in gathering information on heat-related deaths due to the current processing time of documentation in the Ontario IntelliHealth system. So in short, the data monitoring has begun, but there is room for future improvements to our data collection methods. So a later stage demand included free transit on days when public health had declared a heat warning. Council's response was to provide a limited quantity of free bus tickets. 500 pairs of bus tickets were included in cooling kits, and another 1,000 were made available at public facilities like pools and rec centers. Acorn distributed more than 40 of those cooling kits this summer. Acorn Hamilton successfully campaigned for a $52,000 expansion to the existing Ontario Works air conditioner subsidy, which would encompass all low-income families who had a medical need for mechanical cooling, not just Ontario Works recipients. We also reached out to the community for air conditioner donations and were able to distribute those to households that were either denied the subsidy or would not be eligible. Next slide, please. So yeah, we believe that we have made significant strides towards expanding heat-related social programs, and now looking to 2025, we need to make sure that council passes an adequate temperature bylaw. I delegated on this issue for the 2025 budget this past Monday, alongside lawyers from the Canadian Environmental Law Association and the Hamilton Community Legal Clinic. There's still more work to be done to gain majority support for an adequate temperature bylaw. Hamilton, you know, as Eddie mentioned, Hamilton kickstarted this campaign. We've been a national leader on this issue, and so we're really trying to convince council that we should also be the first ones to cross the finish line. So we are, yeah, still waiting to see who that goes. So
Awesome.
that is, yeah.
Thank you, Stuart. Yeah, sorry, man. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's okay. I was just passing. I was just trying to remember your name. So you chiming in now is perfect.
I got you. Thanks, Stuart. I appreciate it very much. And I mean, I live in Winnipeg, so I can say this, I think. Hamilton is one of my favorite cities in Ontario, and it's no doubt, I understand why. I can see why. It doesn't surprise me that Hamilton is leading on this and a lot of other social justice issues. So we'll go to Tara next, but I want to remind people that there is a Q&A box in the bottom of your screen. So if you go down, you'll see it next to the share button. You can ask questions anonymously or non-anonymously, and then we will do a Q&A after Tara and Housen finish. So Tara, I'll pass it over to you.
Can you hear me okay and see me okay?
Yes, we
I
can.
can hear you and see you loud and clear.
Okay, great. So I want to thank Z Banji at LIEN for inviting me, and to all the other organizers and presenters who made this conference happen today. It's really great to hear about the terrific things that are happening in Hamilton and Ottawa and elsewhere. So we started out in Kingston, two groups, SCAN, which is Seniors for Climate Action Now, and 350 Kingston, together to address heat after we heard about the work in Hamilton. We originally met on Zoom with Stuart, who we just heard from, and another member of ACORN, Olivia O'Connor, and they were able to report on their efforts in Hamilton, which included a draft bylaw, the process it took to get there, and the allies that they had secured. So we started first by trying to secure supporters. We knew already from speaking to Stuart that ACORN, LIEN, ACTO, and CELA were already working on it. In Kingston, we approached the Commissioner of Environmental Sustainability for the Alma Mater Society at Queen's University. That person had been working with students to try to retrofit some of the units to adapt to climate change, so he was supportive. I spoke on the telephone to Brian E. Halpin at the Ontario Human Rights Commission. She said the ORC was advocating that landlords the regulation for extreme heat be in the Residential Tenancy Act as an essential service. We agreed that that made the most sense, as did most of the people that we talked to in Kingston. A regulation in the RTA would be applicable to all landlords in Ontario. And that would be more efficient and effective than individual municipalities trying to get individual heat bylaws passed. However, we also agreed that given the current provincial government we have, it wasn't likely at all that that was going to happen. There were several groups we approached who were unable to actively support us. There are 3 Kingston physicians known to be very active in social justice related health issues, but they said they were too busy. The Kingston Community Health Centers was interested, but they were in between executive directors and couldn't commit. The executive director of the Kingston Community Legal Clinic told us that he was too busy and they didn't have time to be involved. But it is great to see so many legal clinics that are at this conference today. And I spoke on the phone on 2 occasions to our public health unit's manager of environmental health. And later, some of us went there and spoke to her and her team in person to talk about the issue. She indicated that public health also was unable to support efforts over municipal heat bylaw. But again, I'm glad to see there are many public health people here on this call today. The public health in Kingston, best that they're able to do is they're working with the city to create a public health campaign on the dangers of extreme heat, and they're trying to determine locations for cooling centers. The same people in SCAN and 350 met with St. Lawrence College student government. They allowed us to leave some information there. And we also visited Kingston's Senior Center. And as we all know, seniors are one of the most vulnerable groups that are negatively affected by extreme heat. The Senior Center did not post any of our information, however, and later when we spoke to them about endorsing our October 1st event, you may remember that SCAN had a nationwide campaign on October 1st. We learned that they cannot support such issues because they are, quote, too political. After that, well, actually before that, this is all kind of happening simultaneously. We approached 2 city councilors who are both on Kingston's Board of Public Health, and they agreed to put forward a motion to City Council, which happened on August 8th, 2023. 4 of us presented. And while we requested that the councillors introduce a motion we had drafted based on Hamilton's motion for an adequate temperature bylaw, instead they put forward a motion to explore the feasibility of such a bylaw. And I can see from Stuart's presentation that that is what's happened pretty much everywhere. They were also directing city staff to bring a report back the first quarter of 2024 that would identify timelines and requirements for the development of an adequate temperature bylaw. We're nearing the first quarter of 2025 and no report has yet materialized. In our ongoing communications with one of the councillors, it has emerged that Kingston has put the report on hold until Ontario's Bill 97 becomes law. In a recent email, that councillor reported that Kingston's municipal government does not have the power to pass a heat bylaw, but that Bill 97, and I quote, might give them that power. She said that in the meantime, the city will create a more fulsome heat strategy that would involve outreach to landlords and potentially additional supports for them to help tenants, but no help for tenants. Some other activities we've initiated include the creation of a pamphlet outlining the dangers of extreme heat and what supports the public can offer to make the creation of a municipal bylaw a reality. A petition asking the City of Kingston to create a bylaw that would direct landlords to keep the temperature of rental units below 26 degrees Celsius. And we circulate that at our weekly climate demonstrations and at any other activities and events that we might have that are related. We initiated a mass email campaign through SCAN to direct its members to contact Kingston's mayor and city councillors to voice their support for an adequate temperature bylaw. We've introduced, we're involved in ongoing outreach to potential allies and also in ongoing research into best practices for active and passive cooling. Well, we are
Tara, sorry to interrupt you, but we're running short of time. So if you quickly wrap this up, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to say while we're stalled, we're not giving up. We do have plans to return to council to present our petitions and to continue to advocate for a heat bylaw. There's a lot of resistance in Kingston. It's a pro-development town. They really depend on private landlords to create housing for people, and it's not an easy sell.
Well, thanks for fighting the good fight, Tara. Really appreciate it. And thank you for sharing this with us. I'll pass it over to Howsen from the Toronto Environmental Alliance. Take it away.
Yeah, thanks. And it is Howsen, so you pronounce it correctly. My name is Howsen. I'm the climate campaigner at Toronto Environmental Alliance. I kind of want to just touch over 3 general areas. First, to give you an update on Toronto. And what's been happening in Toronto. This past June, a series of different organizations that includes many of the people here, but also included Toronto Environmental Alliance. You have ACORN and ACTO and the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, Climate Justice Toronto, CREW, LIEN, housing and homelessness activists. We all came together and we said, hey, let's do a press conference. Let's create a coalition. And we did a press conference early June, and then it got a lot of media play. And then about a week later, we were hit with her first major heat wave, and then we got a lot of additional media play over the next several weeks as well. What's happening at the city level is multifaceted. So the city has the city of Toronto has a couple of months ago had public surveys sent out on extreme heat inside buildings, and those surveys were targeted. There were 2 sets of surveys. One set was specifically for tenants, and one set was specifically for landlords. So it seems as if the city is trying to figure out how to do both, given that there are both tenants and landlords. in the city, and everyone has different roles to play in terms of ensuring that people are safe. The city also is expected to put together an updated resiliency strategy that's supposed to be released in 2025. A little bit more about the coalition as well. This coalition, the asks for the coalition are basically what folks have already been talking about from the other cities. So we're talking about a maximum heat bylaw. We're talking about access to direct cooling for tenants, particularly tenants who need those resources more urgently than others. We're also looking as well at things like cool rooms for large buildings, free TTC transit on extreme heat days, making sure that the city's existing, not fantastic, but it does exist, heat relief network is actually resourced for extreme heat days, which it oftentimes isn't. So there's a series of things that we're trying to do within the city of Toronto, and that city's staff we know are also kind of working on. But it does require a significant push, not just from the policy making angle, but also from the public perception angle. And so I wanted to speak a little bit about that importance, about the importance of the timing that we had in this coalition when we planned to do this just as the summer was coming, so that media knew who to talk to, and then that gave media a kind of like a one-stop shop for them to call and say, hey, I want to talk to a person who has direct experience being impacted by extreme heat. And because we had people from Crew and from Acorn in the coalition, we were very easily able to move journalists to that in order to tell the story again and again and again over the summer. I think that was vital in terms of moving this conversation forward across the country. And I know I had got some, I myself had some interviews from like Bloomberg and like the Agenda on TVO and things like that. So that was a very interesting learning, is to plan for the hot days as part of the communications and public awareness strategy, because it will be those hotter days when people are thinking about it more, and the public is thinking about it more, and journalists are thinking about it more, given the stresses that journalism is facing these days. I finally want to talk a little bit about the as an environmentalist, an environmental justice advocate, the potential opportunities on the buildings retrofits piece, because the city of Toronto has a net zero plan that's supposed to set the city to net zero by 2040. In order to get there, we need billions of dollars of retrofits for all existing buildings. From the most recent Atmospheric Fund climate report that came out just yesterday, I believe, just yesterday, yes. It's clear that it's starting to move, especially larger buildings with more units in them, that we are starting to see investments in building retrofits to decrease carbon in those buildings. And with the carbon decreasing, there is a significant opportunity to switch boilers out for heat pumps, which will do both cooling and heating. And so thinking about it in terms of how we can ensure that resources are made to make it easier as we cut emissions, to also make temperatures comfortable for everybody is part of the challenge that we are trying to figure out at T, how to ensure that those opportunities are available, particularly to those who don't necessarily have the capital in order to do that work. So those are the three general areas as well. If you're in Toronto, we also encourage you to get involved in the 2025 budget process, and also on the 26 to 2030, the city's doing a 5-year climate plan where resiliency and especially responses to heat and flooding are a significant aspect of that plan. And so we do encourage folks to do that. And I'm happy to chat with folks and answer any questions people may have about those. So I'll bring it back to Abby. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Howson. Really appreciate it. So I see this, like, there's a couple of questions here in the Q&A, but I'm going to do something, something bold, perhaps dangerous, by trying to see if I can create one composite question and ask the same question to all of our speakers. Maybe we'll start with you, Eddie, and then maybe just go with the same presentation order. And this is a question that gets asked often. It is in the Q&A, but it's also something that gets asked offline as well, which is this. Given your experience advocating on this issue to city councils, and councils come and go, right? And their priorities keep changing over time. And sometimes you will end up with a council that, is a little bit more focused on like the budget, and they don't want to spend money doing things that they don't see as within their mandate to do. And I know, further down in this presentation, there will be an advocacy toolkit, an activist toolkit that'll get into some of that. But I want to ask you folks first is, from your experience working with councils of different flavors, what is like one piece of advice that you would give to other people who are interested in kind of, doing this in their own communities, particularly around working with councils that may be a little bit reluctant to see this as a priority issue? Eddie, any one piece of advice from your personal experience?
Well, honestly, one piece of advice, it's not the most exciting advice, but one thing I would say is that if you can get staff on your side, that can help a lot, because the city councilors will very often, they listen to staff. And I find that, like, here in Ottawa, it's we to get things passed, we have to build something of a coalition, because there's a certain number of councilors who we know are always going to be on our side, and that there will be sort of councilors in the middle who could kind of go either way. And I find that really, having, being able to win over staff, honestly can work wonders on winning over the more fence sitting members of council.
Awesome. Thanks, Eddie. And Stuart, I'll go to you. And so just what we were, just to repeat the question, it was, having worked with different councils, in your experience, like, what is one piece of advice you would give to other people in other communities on how to best interact and engage with councils who may be kind of sitting on the fence, who may not see this as a priority issue?
Find a reason for them to think that it's a priority. If that means getting a seniors group on your side, because politicians listen to seniors time and time again, do that. If that means getting a little more publicity, then do that. If that just means repeating yourself ad nauseum, year after year, do that. It's not going to be the same for every counselor, and different people respond to different types of triggers. So you just got to figure out what it is for this one. Some you may never be able to convince, and that's where the being politically active comes into play as well. Try and get the progressive candidates that you like elected, because I think all municipalities in Ontario are 4-year terms. So once they're in, you've got some time to work. And also some councillors may see, like, their thing may be, well, what does the majority of my coworkers think? So they might just switch sides once you get the support of others. And yeah, having a good relationship with staff is also very good. And if you are someone like me who likes to be sarcastic and sardonic and make those jokes, don't. You know, don't burn your political capital unless you absolutely have to, because it's just not worth it. You have to deal with even the ones you don't like. You still have to deal with them. So having a good relationship with staff and all the counselors is good. That doesn't mean you don't hold them accountable. You know, you just do it in a professional way.
So pick your battles, pick your friends, choose your lane, and keep on working. Does that sound about right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Thanks, man. Tara, let's go to you. What do you think?
Yeah, those are two good pieces of advice. Unfortunately, city staff here is not very on board. We tried to, focus on those counselors who we thought might be supportive. And the motion about the feasibility of a bylaw was passed unanimously, but there's really been, they're really stalling on this issue now. Bringing up Bill 97, they say they cannot do anything until that it becomes actual law. So that's frustrating. Kingston is a very timid municipality. So I think what would really help Kingston is to have the momentum build across the province. If different cities are passing, adequate temperature bylaws, I think Kingston could be persuaded to do so too. They don't like to stick their necks out though. And I think another thing that could be done, because I really do think that it's best to be in the Residential Tenancies Act, we could all ask our municipal councils to lobby the province to make that happen. Again, that's something my council is very reluctant to do, but if it was a mass kind of movement, I think that would be helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. That's right. Sometimes, no one wants to be the tall poppy, I guess, right? And so some councils want to follow, are more comfortable following, I guess. And so, maybe councils like Hamilton or Ottawa or Toronto can lead the way, and then perhaps the rest of us could follow. Thanks. And then Howson?
I mean, Toronto also likes to follow. Just so you know. Yeah, I would say, I mean, I absolutely agree with what everybody else has said. That's all of those as well. As I would say, like for me, when I try to work with councils, I try to figure out what is for each individual counselor, what is important to that counselor, and what is that counselor worried about and finding a risk about, right? So I find that for a lot of the maximum heat bylaw issues, they are oftentimes concerned about what landlords, in particular large landlords, are going to say, and large landlords are going to make arguments around cost and around the impact of that cost on tenants. And so trying to figure out like what kinds of systems and programs or how can we implement, a maximum temperature bylaw in such a way that will reduce that argument and reduce those impacts, because a lot of those impacts are real. They're not going to use false impacts in order to prevent a bylaw from happening, right? So that is the largest argument that they're going to have, is the impact it will have on things like rent and stuff like that. And so that's one of the reasons why, like, for example, T has also supported a renovictions bylaw, which has just passed through Toronto City Council, like it was either this past committee or the committee after the council before that. And making sure, and we're also trying to figure out how do we finance these programs in such a way and provide financing, particularly for example, like social housing, that will, in a way that will give the city the power to say, well, here's your money, but in order for you to actually do these retrofits, that will cut carbon and make it more comfortable for people, especially on hot days, you are not allowed to increase rents outside of the regular AGIs. And so those are the types of things that we're talking about, and we're trying to think through, is like what are the what are the interests of the counselors, and what are those risks? And those interests and risks sometimes are policy, but oftentimes could also be personal, and could also be, their own desire to potentially like go into provincial or federal politics, right? And I always think about that kind of stuff. And we are in a very interesting space right now politically, where what is being defined as like right wing versus left wing is very fluid, and potentially it's an opportunity for us to get some of these things through and passed.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Stuart. Thanks, Eddie. Thanks, Housen. Thanks, Tara. I know some of you have to go and duck out. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing your perspective. And one thing that came out from this particular part, for me anyway, is just the value of collaborations and working together and working across, not just across different communities, but also with different groups within our community so that we can find different ways through which we can advocate for the things that we care about. So where are we on the agenda? We are on time and and under budget. So that's good news. So now what we will do is we will go over to my friend Jackie from SELA and the Low Income Energy Network. And so what Jackie is going to do is address, actually, there were some questions in the Q&A that I think this presentation will nail, which is a legal opinion on municipal powers around creating maximum heat bylaws and a toolkit for activists. And Jackie, you tell me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of this is that this is coming from what we are hearing from communities, right? So when community members are going to go talk to council, sometimes they get a pushback on like, oh, I don't know if this is the role for the municipality. I don't know if we have the ability to do this. I don't know, blah, blah, blah. And so what you've done is try to address those particular concerns that some councils are using to kind of sit on the fence and push back. So I'll pass it over to you. Take us away, Jackie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. So this presentation is exactly that. It's going to look at, first of all, the legal authority of municipalities to act on maximum heat and pass a maximum heat bylaw. And then I'm also going to present a new activist toolkit that's available on the SELA and LIEN website that we hope will help local activists in moving this issue forward. So why am I bothering with this presentation? I'll try to make it interesting. It is law, but this is an area where both municipalities and the province could act to address maximum heat in tenant apartments. And we want activists to have a sense of why municipalities can move forward, so it's not a barrier to their activism if that's where they're focusing in their work. We have heard, and we heard again from Tara, and we have heard in Hamilton as well, that there is some concern at municipalities about the authority that they have. So we don't want to clarify the law in this area. When you talk about in Ontario, where municipalities get their power, the first place to look is a piece of legislation called the Municipal Act. It's a piece of legislation, all legislation actually is available online. So if you want to later go look at where these sections fall, you can go to a website called CanLII, CANLII. It's free. And you can look up all pieces of legislation in Ontario and in Canada and see all the language that I'm talking about. The City of Toronto gets its authority from the City of Toronto Act. I'm not going to address that today, although the language is very similar to what I'm talking about in the Municipal Act. The first section that I wanted to draw to your attention is Section 8, and it provides what we call interpretive guidance to the courts if they're ever looking at and judging whether a municipality has the power to act in the way that they have and pass bylaws. And there's a few things that are quite interesting about this Section 8 in the Municipal Act. The first is that the use of the words broad powers and broadly happens twice in one paragraph. And it ties those broad powers to enabling the municipality to govern its affairs as it considers appropriate and to enhance the municipality's ability to respond to municipal issues. It's fairly striking language, and it sets the tone for how the courts look at municipalities when they've acted. Section 8 sub 3 that we've also included on this slide gives powers through bylaws to regulate or prohibit matters. And I just wanted to draw attention to section sub B, which is it also allows through bylaws municipalities to require persons to do something, to do things respecting the matter that they have passed the bylaw on. The other two key sections for activists working on these and other municipal issues to be aware of is that sections 10 and 11 of the Municipal Act list subject matters that can be addressed through municipal bylaws. So Section 10 is for single-tier municipalities. So you'll have to check what type of municipality you're working in. And Section 11 is for lower tier and upper tier municipalities. Both sections state that municipalities can pass bylaws about economic, social, and environmental well-being of the municipality, including respecting climate change. Clearly of interest to us in talking about the impacts of climate change and maximum heat. Also, quite relevant, the health, safety, and well-being of persons, and the protection of persons and property, including consumer protection. There are some other sections of interest in the Municipal Act. I'm not going to go into them in detail in this presentation, but they're listed here. It's sections 425, 436, 444, 445. It's a bit of a long piece of legislation if you do take me up on looking it up on Canly. But what these sections do is give municipalities authorities to create offenses if you don't comply with a bylaw. It also allows inspections and order-making powers. The other interesting piece of legislative authority, so a piece of legislation that gives municipalities power, is the Building Code Act. And I wanted to draw your attention to Section 15.1, sub 3. This talks about municipalities passing bylaws prescribing property standards. So they talk about it in terms of the maintenance and occupancy of property. A bylaw can prohibit the occupancy of a property if it doesn't conform to the standards that are passed. And it can also make requirements, the bylaw can make requirements on landlords to repair and do maintenance work to conform with property standards. Under this regime, under the Building Code Act, Section 15.2 provides for the enforcement of these standards. So I've listed some of the requirements in an order that's made under this act to give you a sense of how it could work. But you have to give, as an inspector, reasonable particulars of the repairs to be made, indicate the time that you have to comply. If the owner doesn't comply, the municipality does have powers to carry out the repairs at the owner's expense. And then there's a deadline to appeal. And that deadline, I also want to bring to your attention, it's in Section 15.3, sub 1, and it allows for landlords who have been given an order under the Building Code Act to appeal to the Superior Court of Justice within 14 days. When you look at this authority, the reasonable time it would take to make repairs or updates to a unit, this does build in some unwelcome delay. So I just did want to bring it to your attention, the appeal rates. Turning now to case law, those acts are quite similar to the pieces of legislation giving municipalities authority across the country. The Spraytech and Hudson case remains the leading case on municipal authority to address local environmental and health matters. And I'm also going to mention at the end of my spiel about this case that it was also a blueprint for successful activism on a local environmental issue. The Spraytech case arose out of a municipality in Quebec. And so the legal authority that's being looked at in that case is actually the Quebec Act. What happened was that the small municipality of Hudson passed a bylaw banning cosmetic use of pesticides. And the concern of activists at that time, and still, is that the cosmetic use was creating health concerns for local residents. The municipal authority to pass that bylaw in Hudson, Quebec was challenged, and it made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court said was quite important. So what they said is, first of all, general welfare provisions in statutes like the Quebec Cities and Towns Act and the Municipal Act in Ontario and other like acts across Canada, conferring municipal power allows municipalities to respond quickly to new challenges facing local communities. Anyone who's wishing to challenge municipal authority has the burden of proving they don't have it. Put another way, there's a presumption that the bylaw is valid. The bylaw relating to pesticides in that case was found to have a purpose to promote the health of the municipality's residents. I think there's a clear parallel there in terms of maximum temperature bylaws and other bylaws trying to address heat as a health concern. And there's no need to speak of conflict unless there's an actual conflict in operation. So the way that the court put it was that if there are rules from other levels of government, federal or provincial, that say yes, and a municipal bylaw says no. One says yes, one says no. That's the type of operational conflict that you need to be concerned about. So you're being told to do two inconsistent things. In that case, the court looked at both a federal and provincial piece of legislation that regulated parts of our pesticides regime. So they looked at the Federal Pest Control Products Act, which regulates import and export, sale, manufacture, registration and packaging of pesticides. And they characterized that legislation as permissive rather than exhaustive. That's the wording that the court used, and found there's no conflict. Similarly, the provincial legislation was the Pesticides Act, and it established a permit and licensing system for commercial applicators of pesticides. But again, the court found that it was complementary, that there wasn't a conflict, and that this was truly a scenario where there could be tri-level regulation of an environmental issue. I mentioned that this was also an approach that I think is of interest to us here because local activism in that case was able to get these bylaws passed, first in Hudson, Quebec, and then in municipalities in Ontario and across the country. And then in Ontario, once enough municipalities had passed these rules, a provincial rule was brought into place. The CropLife case was a very similar challenge in Ontario to cosmetic pesticide use. And the Ontario Court of Appeal again upheld municipal bylaws dealing with the subject. And it has established the legal test that still applies for looking at conflicts. So the legal test is 2 stages. And it's quite similar to spray tech, although this is the one that you'll see referenced. Is it impossible to comply simultaneously with the bylaw and the federal or provincial piece of legislation? Or does the bylaw frustrate the purpose of the federal or provincial bylaw? If the answer is yes to either question, then there's a conflict. But if not, there isn't. And that language, for your reference, this is potentially too much information, but in the Municipal Act, that legal test has been placed in the Municipal Act. So this is the CropLife legal test. It's also found in the Municipal Act. There's some interesting cases looking at the broad power of municipalities to act. I mentioned this Volcano Cafe case. The subject matter is a bit different. It was a bylaw looking at smoking indoors in different spaces. But what the court said about the power of municipalities quite recently in 2023 is of some interest. They said nothing prevents a municipality from, first of all, duplicating provincial legislation if the municipality otherwise has jurisdiction to legislate. A municipal bylaw is not void or ineffective merely because it imposes stricter standards of control than those imposed by provincial statutes. And that's important. And that point was also made citing that spray tech Supreme Court case. I've listed a few brief examples where no conflict was found. In the drain case, this case is quite old, but the Ontario Court of Justice found that the ordinary meaning of words like well-being concerns the health of its citizens. And it also concerns living conditions and prosperity of the people living in a municipality. In that case, the issue was municipal authority to deal with garbage and debris that had become quite serious on a neighbor's lawn, and the court found that they could. In the Newmarket and Halton recycling case, the Superior Court of Justice highlighted that public nuisance powers at the municipality didn't conflict with similar powers under the Environmental Protection Act, that there wasn't anything in the Ontario legislation that intended to what they call occupy the field, to say that only the Ontario legislator can act on those subjects. And in the Kenora and Iker Holdings case, the Superior Court of Justice was actually examining powers relating to some housing, but its finding is of interest because they talk about the broad powers of municipalities to pass bylaws, and they have this list in the case. So they say zoning, fire codes, policing, property standards, unsafe buildings, and public nuisances. And the court notes that municipalities have been given a number of statutory remedies, as they put it, powers, to deal with premises where protection of the public interest is at stake. The second branch of that Municipal Act and Crop Life legal test about a conflict is that you can't frustrate the purpose of, in this case, the Residential Tenancies Act. And what the courts have said is that legislation is only considered a complete code if it provides a comprehensive treatment or contains a comprehensive list of laws in that particular field. And in the case of maximum temperature bylaws, whether it's looking at the Residential Tenancies Act or the Bill 97 amendments that were brought in and passed, although they are not in force, there isn't a lot of cause for concern about occupying the field. They address, Bill 97 addresses a pretty narrow issue. So what the issue was is that there's landlords that are preventing tenants from purchasing and installing their own portable or window air conditioning units. And then if they were installed, Bill 97 says the landlord can charge for additional electricity. I would call this language permissive. It allows tenants to do something. Landlords are not able to stand in the way of it, but there's no language that would, for instance, say that this is the only rule that can apply in relation to cooling. And it doesn't set any standard for maximum temperatures in rental units. Landlords don't have to do anything to comply with these provisions. It's not a complete code, as that is understood in the case law. And I have a few examples, so I'll give you a few examples. In the Kenora case that I just mentioned, the Kenora and Iker Holdings case, the Ontario Superior Court of Justice looked at this kind of frustration of purpose problem as it related to property standards at the municipal level in the Residential Tenancies Act. And the court found that the purpose of the Residential Tenancies Act and the Municipal Act don't conflict. And the city can act in furtherance of its duty to promote and protect the public interest. Some of those listed categories that I mentioned at the beginning in Section 10 or Section 11. In another interesting example, in a Fodor and North Bay case, the Ontario Superior Court of Justice highlighted that the Residential Tenancies Act is concerned with the relationship between landlords and tenants. And by way of contrast, a bylaw addressing licensing of rental units and minimum property standards is concerned with the rights and responsibilities of landlords and their relationship with the city. So there is already case law upholding municipal action and finding a difference, that there's no conflict in purpose between the Residential Tenancies Act and these municipal bylaws looking at similar issues. The key takeaway messages are this. First of all, recall that most municipalities already act to regulate temperature by setting minimum temperatures. And some municipalities, like Mississauga, which was mentioned, have taken steps to set maximum temperature standards for some units, usually only for those with cooling in place. But with respect to this idea of legal authority, there's already a clear demonstration of municipal authority to regulate temperature in rental units, in all rental units. The Municipal Act and the Building Code Act provide this broad legal authority to work on property standards and environmental issues, and the case law is quite supportive. It talks about broad legal authority, about minimizing conflicts, about presumption of municipal bylaws being enforced. And the case law already does distinguish between the purposes of the Residential Tenancies Act and municipal action on property standards issues. The legal citations and specifics, and now that I've gone through the presentation, are here in the presentation that will be available on the LIEN website, if that can give you some comfort in responding to any issues that are raised. And we did also write a letter to the Hamilton Planning Committee addressing this issue specific to Hamilton that's available on the CELA website. With that, I'm going to turn to the activist toolkit that Abby mentioned. So I'll give my colleague Kate a second to bring that up on the screen. We're hoping that this makes it easier for activists in municipalities where there's lots of action and in municipalities where there isn't yet, make it easier to bring forward demands for maximum temperature bylaws in your local municipalities. So what it does is provide some information about the dangers of extreme heat indoors. And then it also provides some model legal language that could be used or adapted in a bylaw in your municipality, and a template for what are called deputations. So deputations are presentations to municipal city councils or committees at the municipality. On the 4th page of the advocacy toolkit, you'll see some background information. This information is Canada-wide and somewhat specific to Ontario. I would recommend, if you have the time or if you want some assistance, you can please reach out to bring in some local statistics about heat in your area, poverty in your area, vulnerable people who are vulnerable to heat in your communities. I think those local statistics really add a sense of urgency and an understanding of this issue. But you'll see in this part, there's some references footnoted to how much Canada's overall temperature is rising. It's not good news. It's worse than the global average. Some references to declarations at the municipal level of a climate emergency, and some statistics about how often people spend time indoors. We've also included in this toolkit some background information on why 26 degrees. And in brief, the 26-degree maximum comes from quite a few places. Primarily the literature. So we've identified quite a few articles that identify an indoor temperature of 26 degrees, where over which you start to see a real increase in health impacts from indoor heat. And also from the BC Coroner's report after the really awful 2021 heat event, where at least 619 people died. 26 degrees indoors was identified as a key threshold over which you saw increased health risk. On PDF page 5 of this toolkit, we've also included a section on why public cooling centers are not adequate to address this issue. In our view, they're not easily usable by many of the people most vulnerable to heat. We heard Anushin talking about seniors, people with disabilities, and the buildings in St. Jamestown. And we agree there needs to be a real understanding of whether those people can use and will benefit from cooling centers, as opposed to addressing the problem inside in their homes. And we've also mentioned that the BC report found that it was people who were in their apartments, in their homes that were over 26 degrees throughout the event, throughout the extreme heat wave, that were most at risk. PDF pages 6 and 8 of this toolkit provides some model language. So we've referenced many of the Municipal Act sections that I just mentioned in this presentation. We also add some definitions, so adequate and suitable cooling, and with that threshold of 26 degrees, and some other definitions about what's habitable space and where this would apply. And then some model language, looking at the installation of cooling equipment by the landlord and safely installed by the landlord to meet the 26-degree threshold, and a deadline for implementation. And then finally, before I turn it back to Abby, I wanted to mention that the third part of this toolkit is a template deputation. As I mentioned, a deputation is the word that's used when you make a presentation to either city council or a committee of a municipal council. Often the deadline, you're given 5 minutes. So this is timed at approximately 5 minutes, although that's not actually always true. And so you do need to check with your local municipality about how long you have. You will often be given those instructions when you sign up to speak. It again goes over many of the same issues, but it gives some background and some information for your municipal council on key components of a bylaw, including the maximum temperature for all rental units. Again, we would recommend adding in more local resources if that is possible. And we hope that this will make it easier, that you can use it however you see fit, so that you can use it as a bit of a template or as a place to start in making a presentation about this issue. So with that, thank you very much. And I'm going to turn it back over to Abby.
Awesome. Thanks, Jackie. That was pretty cool. And I know, so if you folks have questions for Jackie, we will do Q&A at the end after a couple more other presentations. And so what we're going to do next is a couple of presentations, one from me, one from our friends at Actor. We're going to talk about, okay, like given this context, like what will happen if and when municipalities do take action on this, and how can we kind of mitigate any potential downsides that may come from taking action on any of these things. We're sharing my screen, starting my presentation. Okay, so thumbs up if you can see my screen. Sounds good. Okay. Yeah, so what I want to talk about really today is that given this context and background about municipal advocacy on bylaws, I want to touch a little bit on something that I think I have experienced and something that we at the Low Income Energy Network and in part at Efficiency Canada, we try to address, which is that there is sometimes a lot of unconstrained optimism and optimism that a policies that will help us get to a climate-ready future will invariably and inevitably also be good for renters and tenants. And I want to make the point I'm hoping to make through today is that there's nothing inevitable about this, that we actually have to be paying close attention to the kind of policies we put in place so that the negative consequences of that don't accrue primarily to tenants, and that the benefits of the kind of policies that we advocate for flow through directly and benefit primarily renters and tenants. And so I want to talk about why that can be a hard thing in practice and provide some kind of guidelines on how we can achieve that goal. So here is why we need policy attention to this issue. So renters are about a third of Canadians, and they are one of the fastest growing demographics in Canada is renters. We have more renters now in Canada than there ever were in the entire history of this country. But also renters are, even though they're by percentage, smaller portion of Canadians, they are overrepresented. So a majority, 2/3 of Canadians with low incomes are renters. And actually, interesting enough, it's vice versa. So a vast majority of renters, about 2 in 3 of renters are households in low incomes. Even more so that renters are overrepresented or disproportionately experience some of the negative consequences of poor housing quality and negative consequences of pure climate-ready housing quality. And so renters are more likely to live experience unaffordable housing costs, more likely to live in housing that needs major repairs, more likely to live in housing that has like mold and mildew due to condensation, which in large part happens because of lack of ventilation or like poor insulation between cold exterior walls and then somewhat, relatively warmer interior walls. And renters are also more likely to be dissatisfied and experience significant discomfort across the seasons, both in the summers and winters. And so taken together, renters are, simultaneously, I went ahead a little bit, simultaneously more likely to benefit from improved housing quality, more likely to benefit from energy efficient retrofits, more likely to benefit from climate policy that helps us improve the quality of our building stock, but also by their own, obviously less likely to take action, in large part because they don't have permission to do so, and also because systematically a lot of programs that exist for low-income households excludes renters in Canada. And so where we want to get to, remember the two goals I talked about? One is on getting to like climate-ready future. So we want deep retrofits and highly energy efficient buildings, but we also have a goal of making housing a human right in Canada, and we want people to have housing that meets their needs and it's also secure. So the quadrant we want to be in is the one that's top right, where housing is affordable and secure and meets your needs, but it also is climate ready, by which I mean it not just meets your needs today, but it can also help insulate you, perhaps literally, from changes in the climate and from extreme weather events and from consequences of blackouts and brownouts and stuff like that. Having a thermal resilience where you can stay comfortable in your home even in the event of a power outage and things like that. So that's the quadrant we want to be in. But the challenge with the policy is that it can be difficult to get energy efficiency policy right, by which I mean that when we aim for the top right quadrant, sometimes we may find ourselves at the bottom right quadrant, or we may find ourselves in the top left quadrant. And I'll try to illustrate this with a bit of an example. One of the ways in which, so we wrote a paper about this, and you can access that here. There'll be a QR code at the end where you can download it, and it has a database of policies. So what we mean when we say rental energy efficiency policies is that we try to take both pull from pull from building. So first thing we did is did a interjurisdictional scan across let's say G20 countries to look at what policies there are for rental housing, and it turns out there's actually very, very few. And so what we want to do is to try to think of this as like a mix of policies. So you can pull from climate policies as they relate to buildings, and you can pull from like tenant protection and housing security policies. And together with a 1-2 step, you can expand the universe and the overlap of rental energy efficiency policies. And I'll try to illustrate this with an example. So here is where we find ourselves in Canada, right? Today, now, at this moment, my perspective is that we find ourselves in the bottom left quadrant, because the status quo is that energy efficiency policies, and so almost every province in the country has a low-income energy efficiency programs, and a vast majority of them, especially the ones that do. Are folks having trouble hearing me? Can someone confirm?
Nope, you're
okay.
fine, Abby. I can still hear you.
Right on. Okay. Sorry, Chantel. I'll give you a private presentation afterwards. So here we are. So here in the vast majority of conferences, the vast majority of provinces across the country, there are low-income programs to help households that need support to make their homes more efficient. But a vast majority of them exclude renters. And in terms of like rental policies, so housing security policies so they differ between different provinces. I know in provinces like Saskatchewan and Alberta, there are very few renter protections. In provinces like Ontario, it's a little bit more, but so the landscape of that is different. So under current landscape, I would argue that we find ourselves in the bottom left quadrant. So what if we did this? What if we sort of polled from, and so this is a report that we wrote, Efficiency for All, where we advocated for, like that renters should also qualify for these programs. And so if we advocated for just, if our lodestar, right, was just like climate policy, and we said, you know what, all programs, landlords should qualify, renters should qualify, we should make them universal, anyone and everyone should qualify. I think it's a good climate policy. But one of the challenges with this, and one of the concerns that people have, is that if we use public money to help improve the quality of rental housing, especially in places where there aren't inadequate tenant protections, the costs of those measures will be passed on to tenants. Or that what landlords might do is that if your housing quality improves, that they could use that as an excuse to evict people. So evictions under guise of renovations, which are renovictions. If you don't have adequate tenant protections, your effort to improve housing quality may result, and I don't know if you can see how I try to show this here, is that yes, you may have more efficient buildings, but in terms of secure housing, you might actually, if you don't pay attention to downstream consequences for tenants, you might end up in a situation where a bunch of climate-friendly retrofits might end up displacing tenants. Now, if we then took another approach where we said, okay, yes, we will give public money towards rental housing, but if you receive any kind of funding or support as a landlord to help improve energy efficiency of your rental unit, then you have to sign an affordability covenant, which says that you will agree to keep your units affordable or agree to freeze your rent for a certain period of time in return, in exchange for receiving the funding from government. So you can see there where at least we are using climate policy as a lever to unlock more affordable housing and secure housing for tenants. But chances are that maybe not a lot of landlords, there may be some landlords who do not participate in this. Maybe participation in a program like this may be limited, which is why we find ourselves in the kind of like the top left quadrant. So maybe not enough buildings will participate in a program like this. But for those that do, we're also improving both the housing security, and along this axis, we're also improving the quality of buildings. So with this kind of like one-step, two-step thing, what we can do is to have a mix of policies that help advance both rental energy efficiency. It doesn't have to be, we don't have to accept that this is a compromise. We don't have to accept that there's a tension between climate and affordability and housing security. I think taking this kind of one-two-step thing, we can get to a future where Canadians have housing that they can both afford, and it's secure, and it's also ready to meet the challenges of the future. So here are some examples. And so this is one of the things that I talked about just now, which is, okay, so in Ottawa, in the city of Ottawa, they have a loan program that offers residents of Ottawa now, and they've expanded this to include landlords as well. Is that this isn't a direct install program so much as it's a loan program to help people make energy efficient upgrades on their homes. And so one of the things that they've included in there is like, if you receive this funding from the city of Ottawa as a landlord, then you agree to like keep your rents affordable for a certain period of time. Or because municipalities don't have, and can be a legal thing, may not feel like they have a jurisdiction about enforcing rent freezes or rent controls, things like that. What the city of Ottawa is saying is that we will then have the right to call back the loan, right? We will take the money back because you're not agreeing to the terms that we set when you borrowed money from us, a low interest, zero interest loan. So what the city has done very cleverly, in my opinion, and Efficiency Nova Scotia also has, oh yeah, Aaron is here. Thanks, Aaron. Aaron's been a big champion on this from within the city of Ottawa and is an expert on this policy. So talk to Aaron afterwards if you have questions. So what the city of Ottawa and Efficiency Nova Scotia is able to do is to work within their mandates to still find an opportunity for them to play a role in rental energy efficiency policy by creating an affordability covenant that not only helps improve rental housing, but also helps secure housing for tenants. Here is another example. This is from a BC housing pilot. And so one of the things is that, using financial incentives that utility programs provide to landlords, then using that as an entry point and requiring that projects funded by, let's say, utility or let's say governments must engage with tenants, must provide legal aid and counseling to tenants, so tenants are aware of their rights, and their priorities are reflected in the project design table. And requiring that as a kind of tenant policy, combining that with like funding energy retrofits together, we end up with a rental energy efficiency policy that says every time you do a retrofit program, you need to form a tenant liaison. And especially if we're using public money to improve this, then we should require that every project has a tenant liaison that can work with tenants and that their priorities are reflected in the retrofits that are being done. And maybe, and this is, this may not be a reality today, but maybe sometime soon, is that we have a minimum building performance standards and that we have energy labeling that tells us as a renter or a new home buyer what the energy use of the home that you're about to rent or buy is. And I'll give you this example, right? Like if you go to your local grocery store or a gas station, and you buy a plastic water bottle, don't do it, but as an example, if you buy a plastic water bottle, you turn it around, it'll have a label. And the label will say 0-calorie water. Why is that, right? Because we, in our infinite wisdom as a country, have decided that labels and information helps guide consumer choice and helps guide behavior. And so if you didn't want that if you didn't want that piece of a thing that you're buying at a gas station, you can buy something else. It gives you more choice, it gives you more options. And yet, when you rent a house, utilities are the single largest uncontrollable expense, and you have no idea how much of your budget, your monthly budget, you have to allocate for renting that house. And if you're about to buy a home, especially if you're, a first-time home buyer and a low-income home buyer, you have no idea how much you will spend over the lifetime of you living in that house on energy bills before you buy a home. And so we could have policies that help unlock more consumer choice and help make this more transparent and fair for renters and tenants. And then you combine that with some tenant policies like, indoor temperature standards. And then now you will have a rental energy efficiency policy that says you have the right to be cool. And then we can do this by coordinating across like different silos of utility programs as well. Just because you live in a home that's heated by a gas furnace doesn't mean you don't have a right to air conditioning through like switching to a heat pump, for example. So there are things that we could do on the climate side, but as long as we combine it with the adequate tenant policy side, we can have rental energy efficiency policies that can advance both of those goals. So my appeal to folks around this room, and especially if you're in a position of responsibility for designing policy, is that we need to not think about, what can, rental energy efficiency policies do, or is there tension between housing security and climate? But we need to think in terms of we need to align these policies so that we're delivering on some fundamental rights for renters. So really quickly is that, in the net zero future, renters should have some basic rights. This is right to information on how much you can expect to spend before you rent a house, right to prior and informed consent as a landlord. If you are undertaking energy efficiency retrofits, you have the right to be consulted and that your priorities are reflected in the project planning. And then, when you have to, in the event that you have to temporarily relocate to another residence because we want to do a deep retrofit on your home, you have the right to maintain your residence and come back to your rental unit at the same rent as before. And you have the right to organize collectively and to secure legal aid to help represent your interests. And you have the right to maintain well-being at your home, to make minor upgrades to your own home. I've heard, we've talked actually at a couple of previous LIEN events that some housing societies are even stopping people from doing simple things like putting plastic sheeting on the inside of your own windows, right? And so a right to do minor things around your own home to maintain well-being at your home. So these are, I think, fundamental rights. We don't argue that, when you rent a home, that it has to come with a functioning toilet or it has to come with a functioning shower. You're entitled to some fundamental rights. So in a net zero future, we think that we need to align policy to deliver on some of these fundamental rights. And so I'll conclude with this. Here are some resources. And so there's a database of this kind of rental policies, about, I think there's around 200 of them, pulled from different jurisdictions, on how you can take some climate policies, buildings policies, take some tenant protection and housing security policies and combine them to create rental energy efficiency policies. There's some fantastic work done by our friends at EcoTrust Canada. I know Josephine and Dylan may even be on the call, so you can access their resources there. And this is the Max Heat toolkit that Jackie shared earlier. So I will leave you folks with that. Thank you, and this is how you can get in touch with me. One of the challenges of doing this presentation and emceeing is that I have no idea if I've been over time, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I get a little carried away by this stuff, because this is something that's very close and dear to my heart. So thank you. And let me just stop my presentation, take a quick look at time. Okay, we're doing okay, more or less. And then now I will pass it over. Let me take a quick look at my agenda here. I'll pass it over to Doug and Laura. So Doug and Laura, if you're ready. So I'll just do a quick introduction. So Laura is a community development worker at the Don Valley Community Legal Services, and she works very closely with the colleagues on the housing law team. And she's also worked with counselors in the past on City of Toronto's renovictions bylaw. And she's also a passionate tenant advocate. And Douglas, Doug is the director of director of advocacy and legal services at ACTO, which is Advocacy Center for Tenants in Ontario. Doug has had a long experience working in the community legal services, particularly in the Mississauga location, first as a staff lawyer, then as an associate director, and then in 2017 becoming the co-executive director. And so what Laura and Doug are going to do, if you folks are ready, is to talk to us a little bit about how do we take everything that we talked about today and then put it into practice, and how do we go from tenant activism and from this kind of policy approach, and what does it look like actually turning it into city bylaws? So Laura and Doug, I'll pass it over to you.
Great, thanks. I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and Doug's going to kick us off. So just give me a second. Okay. Okay, can everyone see that? Is this good?
That looks great, Laura.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's our pleasure to present on really how do we get to that perfect quadrant that Abby was describing, how good policy creates an environment where we can achieve both achieve our environmental goals while preserving preserving tenancies and ensuring that tenants maintain their rights and also have access to affordable housing. So our presentation is going to go over renovictions and above guideline rent increases. So next slide, please, Laura. Thank you. So in Ontario, just very plainly, we have a rent control system in Ontario where sitting tenants are protected through provincial measures where their rent can only increase to a specific amount every year, and that's based on inflation. There are certain exceptions to that rule, but generally that is the situation in Ontario. Above guideline rent increases, or AGIs as we call them, are used to circumvent that process, where landlords have used that to just transfer the costs of energy conservation measures to tenants. And renovictions are also, it's happening everywhere across the country, but we're seeing it in Ontario, a significant number of renovictions happening here, where the work is, the landlord is saying that the work is so extensive that the unit must be vacant to perform that work. So these are the two typical processes in which we see where the goal of energy conservation brushes up against tenant security of tenure. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about above guideline rent increases. And it's there's a lot of detail here, but suffice it to say that it's a process in which landlords can obtain a rent increase, apply a rent increase to their tenants of up to 3% every year for 3 years. And that process is typically applied to older rent controlled buildings with established tenants, and especially where land values have significantly increased. So we see it often where there is major transportation or transportation projects underway where properties are values are lifted. There are also and so we also, it's used for typically where capital expenditures that promote energy or water conservation is passed down. And AGIs apply regardless of whether that energy conservation initiative is necessary or unnecessary. Next slide, please. Renovictions are in Ontario are also, as I said earlier, it's where a landlord renovates a unit or building that evicts the tenant in order to complete the renovations. The landlord will typically serve a notice to the tenant saying that they require the unit to be vacant. But the question is, what constitutes the renovation? It does vacant possession is that necessary? And so that is determined at the landlord tenant board, but the initial process is serving the tenants with what's called an N13. Next slide, please. There are some exceptions to the Aggie program. I'm not going to go through all of them, but suffice to say, Aggies are typically applied to private market buildings. I've also pulled from the Residential Tenancies Act the specific legislation that would apply for typical energy conservation programs. So it's where it's identified as capital expenditures, where a program is so extraordinary or significant and renovation, repair, replacement that that if it meets that test, then it can be passed down to tenants. Also, similarly, if there's a substantial or extraordinary municipal tax increase, that can also form an Aggie as well. And so some municipalities might contemplate programs that would mean a substantial increase in property taxes. And so there's that concern, at least in Ontario, where something like that would result in additional burden and economic hardship for tenants if it was passed down as an Aggie. Next slide. So this specifically is where the legislation speaks to the energy conservation, climate change action, and you'll note it's a specific carve out that states that defines any such energy or water conservation initiative would be typically considered capital expenditure, so long as it's extraordinary. And so oftentimes when this happens, there's a discussion that takes place, and there's a debate where landlord insists that, I want to go ahead with energy conservation initiatives, but there's also a strong and very real concern about what the impact is on the individual tenants who live in that building. And so there in Ontario, we give advice, and we ask us and we ask a series of questions of the tenants to make sure that the work that's been done, that's been applied to the building, is done lawfully. So it first takes in the form of questions: what did you receive a lawful rent increase, indicating that above guideline that an Aggie is coming? Have you looked at the form to identify what type of work has been contemplated? Is it adding solar panels? Okay, well, that's easily identified. You just look at the roof. But if it's something that's, say, a more efficient furnace or a boiler, typically tenants can't find that out because they're not in the boiler room. So there are questions about whether or not that actually occurred. So there are some steps that tenants need to just check off to make sure that what the landlord has said that they've done actually has been done. Other steps that they take would be looking at the invoices and making sure they're up to par. Are they organized? People, there are many people who live in the buildings for many years. Have they taken pictures of what the building was before or after? Should they be in contact with their elected official? Because oftentimes those elected officials can help negotiate and ensure that both goals of energy efficiency, climate change action, and tenant protections are met. And also in Ontario, there are community legal clinics that could help support tenants if they have any questions, as well as other tenant associations and groups. Next slide. Thank you. So this is just a little bit about some of the evidentiary pieces that tenants need to make sure that the landlord has complied with and made sure in order to achieve and obtain that above guideline rent increase application. When it doesn't work, you can see in the next picture. Next picture. Thanks, Laura. You can see in the next picture when say a landlord says, "Well, we've done the we've redone or we've renovated the hallway." Sometimes it's always, I should say, that pictures are so important, and having tenants who talk to each other who gather information to ensure that, what the landlord is promising actually has come to fruition is important in these types of situations. And then my next slide is really about tips for successful hearing when it comes to Aggies. I mean, at the end of the day, I think tenants want to live in a safe and habitable unit. But there's they don't, but we've seen many situations in Ontario where these Aggies have been used by financialized landlords to the detriment of tenants in the sense that these capital expenditures have not been for climate change action, but instead have been for aesthetic reasons. And so there's that constant tension that's happening, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that tension when it comes to renovictions.
I think it's over to me now. Thanks, Doug. So hello, everyone. My name is Laura Nonan. I work at Don Valley Community Legal Services as a community development worker. I worked really closely with our housing team on the renovictions bylaw in Toronto recently. That's actually something I've worked on for 5 or 6 years now. I have a bit of a unique perspective and I wear a few different hats. So I used to work for City Councillor Paula Fletcher in Toronto. I've been at the legal clinic for 2 years, and I've also been on the board of the Federation of Metro Tenants Associations, FMTA, for over 3 years now. I do a lot of tenant organizing. I'm a tenant myself. So lots of hats on, and I'm very happy to share all of my experiences and knowledge with everyone today. So this is just a segue slide about renovictions. Everything we're talking about today is connected. So if we do get the maximum heat bylaw and we see landlords, doing retrofits to buildings or homes, does that mean they're going to apply for AGIs? Where are they going to increase our rent? Are they going to renovate and try to renovict folks, right? Everything's very connected. And what I'm going to talk about today is the renovictions bylaw and how we got it, because we got it. It was approved by City Council last week, and it will come into effect July 31st. So I'm going to talk about how we can sort of mirror or use the lessons from the renovictions bylaw to fight for the maximum heat bylaw. Okay, so this is an N13, and it's basically, Doug already went over what a renoviction is. And hit next slide. There we go. So I'm going to do a little story to start us off here. This was the first renovictions case I worked on, and it was a rooming house in Riverdale, which is, if you know where Riverdale Park is, in the east end of Toronto. So 2830 Langley Avenue. There were 24 units, 24 tenants who lived here. Some tenants had lived here for decades. I think there was one person that was over 20 years. And then this was their neighborhood. This was their home. And then in 2018, a new owner purchased the rooming house and issued N13 eviction notices to all of the tenants. They were very scared, and they reached out to their city councillor, which is where I was working at the time. We had a meeting right away. We got our legal clinic involved, which is where I am working now. It used to be East Toronto Legal Services. So they came out, one of their lawyers helped the tenants, took on their case. We organized with Acorn. We love our friends from Acorn. We had rallies. There's some photos from media. We put up signs all over Riverdale saying, "Stop the eviction of our neighbors." The community didn't want this to happen. The street they lived on, everybody knew each other. All of their services were in the area. They didn't want people to be displaced from their community. So we tried our hardest to stop this. Unfortunately, though, it was legal what happened to these tenants, and they were renovicted. And then we started getting more calls about renovictions in Toronto Danforth and then across Toronto. And I started tracking them, and it was just absurd, the number of tenants we were hearing from 2018 and 2019, and it kept increasing. So we got city staff involved. We had building staff work with us. We met with the chief building inspector. We had staff from MLS, Municipal Licensing and Standards, from the Housing Secretariat. We finally had all these people that like to work in their silos, the different divisions at the city, coming together to talk about this renoviction crisis. And this is what paved the way to what happened next. Oh, this is not a slide I wrote. I don't know if Doug put this, if Doug wanted to speak to this one.
Yeah,
Maybe
maybe
they
Laura,
got jumbled.
I can just say that there's legal processes involved in challenging these individual renovictions and aggies, and that's at the landlord tenant board. But in Ontario, it has not worked in the sense that it has not been able to achieve justice for a number of reasons. People can't access it because it's on an online format. As Ivy noted, 2/3 of tenants, renters are low income, so there's that digital divide that's happening. There's also significant delays at the landlord tenant board when tenants are trying to enforce their rights. And the board doesn't penalize bad faith evictions in order to dissuade landlords from continuing to renovate people. And so that's why it's so important that Laura, who is talking about what we can do collectively with our communities and the wonderful accomplishments of introducing and having that anti-renovation bylaw passed in Toronto.
Great, thanks, Doug. Yeah, and as I mentioned, we saw cases like the Langley rooming house where they did go to the landlord and tenant board and they did have representation from a community legal clinic, but it was legal back then and they did get evicted through the LTB. And so it does speak to the justice that tenants may not receive under this process. So then what happened next was in 2019, we created the subcommittee on the protection of affordable rental housing. This was sort of the first meeting that we had where I think city staff and city councilors started to recognize how serious this issue was. We organized over 40 tenants and advocates to make deputations. So they came out to this committee on a cold November evening and told their stories of being renovicted and being displaced from their community. And I think that's what really impacted staff and counselors, to hear these stories, to humanize it. They weren't just stats and numbers. These were people who lost their homes. And this made a huge difference. And of course, from our friends from Acorn, their report came out earlier this year tracking the numbers. It's very alarming. And these aren't even all of the numbers, because a lot of renovictions or N12 and N13 evictions don't even go to the landlord and tenant board. Myself, for example, several years ago, before I started this work, I was N12 evicted and I believed my landlord and just moved out. And that is never captured, that data. So a lot of tenants who do just get the notice, which landlords don't have to file these notices. They just print them off and give them to the tenant, and then the tenant will move out. So these numbers are probably much higher than what we see here on the screen. Okay, so this is the next part here. We started to see, like, what can we do at the city to stop renovictions? We knew the province wasn't likely to do anything, and we heard that New Westminster and British Columbia had implemented a renovictions bylaw. So we took a look at that. We tried to see how we could copy it here in Toronto. The provincial legislation is different from BC and Ontario, so it wasn't going to be exact. I will say city legal staff were not super supportive of this, which is why we relied on the legal clinics and ACTO to help with this, and all of those lawyers said, yes, we can do it. My colleagues at Don Valley Legal were very supportive and pushed for this. So we had other legal experts helping us. We had a counselor championing this at City Hall. We had city staff, aside from city legal, who were very on board with this, from buildings and the housing secretariat. So we were on track here. And then in 2021, we were getting there, and we did create this new evictions handbook at the city. A lot of motions were passed. We were making progress. And then, of course, the pandemic hit and things just went on pause between sort of 2021 and 2023. But what happened in between was our friends from Hamilton. So Hamilton said yes earlier this year. And I think that really lit a fire under Toronto, because, councillors in Toronto said, hey, they beat us to it. We should start doing this again. And I believe it was in February or March this year, it came back to the city's planning and housing committee. And a few councillors wrote a letter saying, let's get this going again. We were so close. Hamilton is outdoing us, so let's see what we can do this year. This is just sort of the nitty-gritty, the details of the Hamilton bylaw, and it's what we suspected was that it was through building permits, because municipalities are creatures of the province. We heard a lot about this earlier today. We're limited in what we can do at the municipal level, but we do have some powers, and it was through building permits and that process that we could get this bylaw in. So basically, I won't go too in depth here, but when you apply, if you're issuing an N13 notice saying my renovations are so extensive, I need the tenant to move out, and you check that box on the N13, it also says that you have building permits from the city. That's how we tied this in. So now when you apply for your building permit, you're also going to have to apply for a new renovation license, and it triggers this whole process. Now the city is monitoring it and making sure the tenant has somewhere to go in between or during the renovation work, and that they do have that right to return after. And one of the most important pieces is this rent gap payments that the landlord will have to make. So they have to either provide the tenant with a similar, or if they do have to move out, they want to stay in their community. And we all know rents are very high right now. So let's say they're paying a month and they want to move a few blocks, $2,000. The landlord has to pay that rent gap. So now they'll have to cover the difference in rent to make sure the tenant can stay in their community and move back after. And this goes through again. In February, the councillors wrote a letter to the Planning and Housing Committee. In June, we had our huge push. City staff released their report, and they said, yeah, Hamilton's bylaw is okay. And they seemed hesitant. And we came out full force in June at Planning and Housing Committee. We were all there. We had a huge media conference outside the committee room. We made deputations. We sent letters. We had a lot of media. We worked really closely with Councillor Fletcher, and I'll say we could not have done this work without her. She was a huge champion and advocate for us at City Hall. And city staff heard us. I think for me, what was a huge moment was when the head of buildings said, hearing from everyone today who made deputations has really made me understand this and why we really need this renovictions bylaw. And like, it was just a huge moment. And they said, we're going to fix it. We're going to come back in October with the draft bylaw. We hear you loud and clear, and we're going to do what Hamilton did. And then here we are. This is the mayor was also so supportive of this. When Olivia Chow ran for mayor last year, this was in her platform. And I'll give her the credit for this. Like, she was very supportive and made sure this happened as well. And it passed city council last week. It's exactly what we wanted. Tenants are going to be protected. The city's in the meantime too, until this has to go through the budget process in February, and it will come into effect July 31st. And until then, though, the city wants to make sure there are things in place to protect tenants from renoviction, and they're actually giving more funding to the Toronto Tenant Support Program, which is amazing. We do also suspect, though, that if N13s are going down, landlords will probably start using the N12, the personal use eviction, more. So we're going to monitor that and see how this goes. And this has also caused this huge, chain of events now where other municipalities are looking at it, because we know Doug Ford in the province will not implement vacancy control and will not do anything to stop renovictions. So cities and municipalities are doing it themselves. We had Hamilton, Toronto, I know Ottawa and London, Kitchener, Guelph have been looking at it. It's just spreading, and I think that's amazing, because if the province won't do it, we have to do it. And then we cannot do this work alone. This is like my huge takeaway. This would not have happened without all of our allies and partners. So all of the legal clinics, FMTA, tenant groups and tenant associations, ACORN, having a city councillor champion it is also huge. Also local organizations and agencies who help people facing eviction, they came out and helped us too. So we cannot fight alone. And then what's next? Just that this is a marathon, not a sprint. And I know we wish it was quicker, And I can see that the maximum heat bylaw has so many similarities in our fights, and I think we can get there though. We just have to work together and continue pushing. And we just had some final thoughts here from Doug and I. How can we ensure the cost of the retrofits if the bylaw does pass, how they are not passed down to tenants through AGIs and rent increases? Doug, did you want to speak to this one?
I think Abby really covers a lot of this, which is ensuring that there are enough incentives in order for landlords to access so that they don't pass down to tenants. And so it's really the measure has the cost been extraordinary for the landlord. If it hasn't met that threshold, and say other levels of government are able to provide a grant or some loan program, then it might not meet that level, and so we might not see Aggies coincide with climate action initiatives. So I would say that's one way of minimizing the number of Aggies that occur.
Right. Yeah, and then we just had enforcement is key when things are out of whack. As we head towards net zero, what does it mean for tenants in disadvantaged communities? So these are just some things to think about and take away. And yes, that's it. I'm gonna stop sharing.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you so much, Doug. That was fantastic. And I think it answered a lot of questions I had in mind and some of the questions that were in the chat earlier as well. And the resources that we've developed at Efficiency Canada in providing a guidance for policymakers on how you can pull climate policies and building policies and secure housing policies together into a mix that empowers tenants and that secures housing, quality of housing, and also secure housing. It can be helpful. And just for the purpose of recording, I'll just repeat really quick the resources that were shared around the table from Doug and Laura, from Jackie, from LIEN, from Sila on how to advocate, how to build relationships, the lived experience that was shared by our community activists earlier who talked about how they're doing this work. Now, all of these resources exist, right? And they will exist on our website, and they will be accessible not just to you because you're registered to attend, but it will be available for everyone on Low Income Energy Network's website. Now, having said that, having these resources is the first of many steps. And what I would encourage everyone as you go away from this call today is to think about how we could all be working together, and in not just in the province of Ontario, because I know in the survey earlier said there were people from BC and there were people from other parts of the country. How can we create like a network of folks who are all rowing in the same direction, and we are elevating the ambition not just of the communities we call home, but of the provinces where we live and work, and in the country, in the big, wide, beautiful country that we call home. How can we elevate ambition across levels of government, and how can we advocate for this issue that is not very glamorous, not very exciting in comparison to other flashy things like electric vehicles, or I mean, not to knock on electric vehicles, or climate emergency declaration, right? That is the task at hand, and I'm really glad that there are so many smart and capable people working on this, and there are so many engaged community advocates working on this. So as we go away, I'd ask you to use these resources, and if you're interested in collaborating across provinces and across jurisdictions, if you have an update of what is working or what is not working in your province, get in touch with Z at Low Income Energy Network. And we will see you all again next year at the Low Income Energy Network Conference. Z, is there anything else you want me to do before we wrap this up?
No, this is good. Thank you everyone for coming. I was especially pleased to see people from across the country attending our conference, and that's one of the real advantages of holding this over Zoom instead of doing an in-person conference like we used to do back in the day. So thank you, everyone. And thank you to all the presenters.
Have a nice weekend, folks.
Bye.
Bye.